intensive dynamic psychotherapy, curative intensive dynamic psychotherapy of previously hopeless and untreatable schizophrenia. Now that's a catchy title. I'm sure a lot of you don't believe it can be done, but let me define what it is that I'm really talking about. Curative. Would 35 years being off antipsychotic medication suffice as a cure? Would 30 or 35 years of return to function, relationships, active involvement in the world serve as a good definition of a cure after previous history of many hospitalizations, overuse of antipsychotic medication, daycares, halfway houses, every ancillary supportive psychotherapy and intervention known? Would that serve as a curative psychotherapy? The dynamic psychotherapy of schizophrenia is a very powerful tool, and yet we often eschew our psychodynamic orientation in favor of the current wisdom about the biological origins of schizophrenia and of psychosis. In so doing, we deny to the patient and to ourselves the ability to change, to transform, to really look at the underlying dynamics. What is schizophrenia anyway? It's probably a lot of things, but it's a withdrawal of energy from the world. It's an attempt by the person to explain their world in a way that seems incomprehensible to others. So we have hallucinations and delusions. And what I've found in dealing with people and in helping them to get at least my version of a cure is that their hallucinations and delusions and chaotic thinking has never been explored before, has never been explored therapeutically. A psychiatrist will say, "Oh, you're a psychotic, take this drug." This has been going on for 50 years. In 1964, there was a study at the University of Wisconsin where they found that the average time spent by a psychiatrist in the emergency room before the prescription of antipsychotic medication was 7 minutes. This is preposterous, but it was true then. I'm quite sure it's true now. What is the intensive dynamic psychotherapy of schizophrenia? It's just our usual old dynamic psychotherapeutic perspective, the belief in the unconscious, in awareness of that, the desire to make sense of previously insensible phenomena. It's looking at resistances, it's looking at transference and countertransference phenomena, but most importantly, it is an attempt to speak schizophrenies. It's an attempt on our part to walk in the shoes of the person or sit in the chair of the person who's sitting there in front of us. What is schizophrenies? It's a person's own language. It's a person's own symbology. And for us to just say, well, that doesn't make sense, you must be psychotic, there, take some medicines, is not very productive. It's anathema to me. Very often I end up seeing people who've been heavily medicated for years and years, and they've never been asked the question about the origin of their delusional beliefs. And this, to me, is one of the most essential factors in the treatment of extremely psychotic people, take a history of their beliefs, take a history of how the beliefs developed, take a history and explore whatever the voices, the hallucinations, the delusions may be about, affectually, time-wise, in the course of the person's life. And as I said in our earlier talk this morning, often there are many different people talking with me as I take a history of all the believed-in entities that these people believe in. It doesn't delegitimize the person. It's actually an attempt to understand, to make sense of who they are and of their life. And as far as I know, all my patients have appreciated it. Well, what I'd like to do is to present 1, 2, perhaps more cases that clearly demonstrate what I would call a curative, intensive dynamic psychotherapy of schizophrenia. And again, by curative I mean someone who was called schizophrenic, hospitals, psychological testing, daycare, halfway houses, loaded up on antipsychotics, and 30 or 35 years later are functioning, have relationships, active in the world. Their energy has gone from their psychotic productions back to the world. They decathected the world. We worked on stuff during the course of psychotherapy, and lo and behold, they cathected the world again. To me, that's a cure. If someone wants to quibble about it, fine, we could have a discussion about that. So I'm going to start to talk, and what I'd like is for you all to be the discussants. And any time you have a question, you don't have to wait for me to finish. I'm a big interrupter. Interrupt to your heart's content and ask. You know, Marilyn, in the previous presentation, talked about her very sensitive and tactful way. I'm not so sensitive. I once gave a talk called Insensitivity Training. I think very often psychiatrists tend to shy away from getting into material. It doesn't mean that one has to be abrasive, but it's important to be willing to enter in, try to make sense of things, and deal with what Murray Jackson called weathering the storms. Eventually, if we're lucky, if we're good at it, if we really care about the work we're doing and the person we're sitting with, we get to the most important place, to what Harry Guntrip in Schizoid Phenomena, Object Relations and the Self, a seminal book which I recommend to everybody, what Harry Guntrip called the lost heart of the self. And there we sit with the patient, with the inchoate self, and gradually, imperceptibly, movement begins to occur, and the person comes out of the chrysalis of psychosis back into the world. Nice idea, nice story. Let's see if I can actually make that be the case. I was on a public radio show a couple of years ago, and when I got there, the staff reverentially gave me an email. Thank you, doctor, you saved my life, da-da-da-da, you know, our work together was so profound, da-da-da-da. And there was a signature. I said, gee, that's funny, I wonder who that is. So I began to think about it, and I kind of had an idea of who it was. And at the end of the radio talk show, I emailed the person back, and lo and behold, it was someone I had finished seeing over 30 years previously. And for the last 30 years, this person had been pretty much out of contact with me, probably for 25 years, had remarried, her husband had died, had married again, had established relationships with her children, worked at 2 highly functional jobs, and led an extremely productive life, dealt with the death of one husband, had lived and functioned. So function-wise, relationship-wise, this person had pulled it together. Let me tell you about this chronic paranoid schizophrenic who came to me. This is maybe 5 years into my career, and I was seeing this very nice guy who was, just a guy, and he said, I knew this girl, I grew up with her, and she's had a really hard time. She was out here, she was married, and she got in the hospital 7-8 years ago after the birth of one of her kids, and she's been through the mill. So, will you see her? I said, sure. So she came in, and of course, as they all do when they're loaded up on antipsychotics, she looked terrible. She'd once been pretty, but she was disheveled and unkempt. Backoven and Solomon, in 1975, in a Journal of the American Psychiatric, described how patients on antipsychotic medication had far less motivation, far less initiative, were much less functional than previous schizophrenic patients who never did take antipsychotics. Did anybody listen? No. When Harrow and Job said the same thing in 2007 in the Journal of Nervous and Mental Diseases, I'm sure that result also about better global functioning on patients, schizophrenic patients who stopped antipsychotics, I'm sure that too was dismissed. So here comes this woman, let's call her Lois. Lois had, as I asked her friend, she'd brought in her records, loaded up on every conceivable antipsychotic known to man. It looked terrible. 7 years of psychiatric treatment, lots of psychiatrists, daycare, halfway house, board and care, everything. They'd done everything they possibly could for her, except talk with her. So I exchanged some pleasantries with Lois. She sits there looking abject. And I look, chief complaint. The doc, and I happen to know who the doc was, had written, paranoid schizophrenic, she believes that 2 rats are eating at her heart. I say, hey Lois, it says here that 2 rats are eating at your heart. Oh yes, and she started to cry. And I said, well, gee, that's a very interesting thing for you to have believed, Lois. I mean, you saw that? She said, yeah, it was right here in my heart. And I said, well, what was it like? And she told me how painful it was, and they kept gnawing and gnawing at her heart. I said, well, Lois, what do you think that means? I don't know. I said, well, surely you've talked about this with your doctors over the years. No, nobody ever asked. I had learned a few years earlier that nobody ever asked. So I say, Lois, let me lay something out to you. I got an idea. This first session, so I don't know if there's much to it, but you got 2 kids, and you were hospitalized after the birth of your second kid, and you had these 2 rats gnawing at your heart. Maybe the 2 rats gnawing at your heart represents your children gnawing at your heart, at your heartstrings. You miss your kids. Bingo. Lois looks at me, says, wow, I never thought about that. So we spend a few sessions talking about this, making sense of, let's call it schizophrenia, a visual image, her metaphor, the symbol contained in what Lois was talking about. And, I start to lower her antipsychotics, which are legion and voluminous, start to lower them down. And as I lower them down, Lois, of course, perks up and starts to look better. And I gradually keep lowering them. After maybe 2 or 3 months of seeing her at twice-a-week frequency, probably because I spoke her language or tried to help her make clear to herself her own metaphor, she starts to tell me her story. And of course I ask, as time goes, as we meet, about her life and what happened. And the story that develops is as follows. She had a harsh, critical mother and a very loving father. She was an only child. And the mother was really nasty to her, and nasty to her father. Her only safety was in ballet. She loved to dance, and she had an old Russian ballet teacher, and he doted on her and said she danced like she was from another planet. So as a young girl, 11, 12, 9, 10, she begins to think, well, my mother hates me. Maybe I'm an alien. Maybe my father's an alien. Maybe we're both from another planet. I mean, the dancing teacher, the ballet teacher said I dance like I'm from another planet. And my mother's an earthling. That's probably why she hates me, the alien. And that helped her deal with the painfulness of her mother's caustic, negative, nasty comments. Okay, you can understand that. Nice fantasy. It was just a fantasy. She didn't really believe it. And then her father, at the age of 13, dies. And she's hospitalized for 3 months. So I'm seeing her 20 years later, and she begins to tell me something she'd never talked about before. And again, she told me this because I was interested in her life, and tried to speak her metaphor and to help her understand her metaphor. She tells me the following. Well, he did die, but he didn't really die. He's here. He's been with me all this time. And I said, you mean right here, where you and I are having a cup of tea? He's having a cup of tea here with us too. I said, ah. So he died, but he didn't really die. He's always been with you. How's he been with you? Loving, warm, caring. I go for a bike ride. He goes for a bike ride with me. I give someone a cup of coffee. I give one to him. Nobody knows he's here. I say, oh, that's so lovely and so understandable. So we talk about this for a couple of weeks. She's just about off antipsychotics, and it's a very fragile time when you're coming off antipsychotics. And it's a very fragile time when you give up a long-held delusional system that had lasted for 20 years, the delusion of her father. So I had to hospitalize her for a couple of days on 2 or 3 occasions for her own safety, because I was very worried about her. Because she was not only coming off antipsychotics, not only giving up a 20-year-long supportive, caring delusion, but she was now finally grieving over the death of her father 20 years before. But seriously, within the space of 2 or 3 weeks, she was able to do that. She was off antipsychotics. I continued seeing her, and then a wonderful thing happened. These are very creative people. I think one of the reasons I like them so much is that they are so creative. I just kind of plod along, but they're very creative in what they do. And a delusion of her 2 children being there with her all the time supplanted the delusion of her father being there with her all the time. So my reaction was very simple. That's wonderful. That's great. That's the best thing I've heard. That's a very positive thing. And I encouraged her to make contact with her children. She'd been so wary of any kind of involvement with her kids. She felt so guilty about what had happened. And her husband, who'd since divorced her and remarried somebody else, was a very nice and caring man when she called him up. And she began very tentatively at first to begin to reestablish contact with her children. I saw her for about another year, year and a half, off medicines, no delusions. She did some volunteer work. Lo and behold, the volunteer work led to a paid position because, as I intimated before, when you withdraw the energy from delusions, you have all that energy which had previously been caught up in the psychotic phenomena available to the world. So she got a paying position at this pretty good organization, and by the time she left therapy, she was working her way up in this organization, seeing her kids regularly, involved in a craft which she was very good at, and seeing a guy. And I would get letters from her over the next few years. She'd now taken over the organization, and she was married to the guy, and da-da-da-da. So I thought that was a good story. But it was set in such high relief when she sent me that email more than 30 years later, indicating that the gains of a dynamic psychotherapy, the guts of which probably lasted 4 months, and the therapy itself, as it tapered down, lasted maybe 1 year 3/4 to 2 years. So wonderful that the gains of that therapy had continued, had lasted over the next 30 years. She and I spoke on the phone several times, and as far as I could tell, she was fine. Well, that's one example. Let me toss it open to the group here. Cure? What do you think? Thoughts? Well, whatever kind of defenses there are, you have to deal with. This person, as I said in the very first session or two, we began to talk about and make sense of the 2 rats. And as I said, for her, she was so grateful to understand that she gradually unearthed all the rest of the delusional material. But I agree, there are certainly plenty of people who are avoidant, plenty of people who just want to stay in their little encapsulated life without anybody coming in. My presence, my asking questions may irritate some people. They might get withdrawn further within to themselves. Everybody's different, and you got to play it as it lays. That's the most important part of any kind of psychotherapy. You can't expect the patient to do what you want them to do. You have to deal with who they are. One of the best teaching lessons I ever had was an old hippie friend who could walk into a room and say, "Hey, what's happening?" And people would begin to start to talk about things. And as a shrink, as a psychiatrist, you essentially say what's happening, and then you deal with whatever defenses and vicissitudes come up. Yeah, there was rage at her mother. There wasn't much of any kind of rage at me. It's fine with me for people to rage. A lot of people rage at me a lot, and it's fine, absolutely fine. And in fact, some therapies are spent with people being angry and realizing that that anger can be accepted, and it's really not that big a deal. All right, well, if there are no more questions about this one, let me present another case. Now, this one was really the first serious case that I saw in my practice, maybe a month into my leaving the residency. I had always thought that psychosis was understandable, and when I was a medical student at Albert Einstein, I spent quite a bit of time doing in-depth work with very psychotic people. I thought it was fascinating. So I arranged to go off to work with Ronnie Lang for the better part of my last year in medical school, and ended up spending time living in a hospital, on the ward of a hospital for maybe 10 days, living with people and just talking with them and just being another person. That was very useful. And it gave me a good sense of what it was like for at least English people to be psychotic. And came back, went to Washington, and while I was there, I was able to go to Chestnut Lodge weekly seminars for 2 years. So I, again, learned a lot about intensive psychotherapy of schizophrenia. By the time I came to Mount Zion, I was pretty convinced it was possible to do it with very crazy people. Only Bryce Boyer in the East Bay was doing it then. There wasn't anybody else out here doing it. But I always knew it was possible. And I say knew, I had the conviction that only youth can give you when you really haven't done the work. So I'm in an emergency room trying to keep the ship afloat shortly out of the residency. And a woman comes in who had been a patient on Mount Zion's unit 3 years before. She wasn't my patient, but I'd seen her in passing in groups. And she came in. She was lonely. I got called out to see someone else, and when I came back, she'd cut herself 4 times. So I got a little irritated with her, and I said, "What'd you do that for? And what does the number 4 mean? Let's get this taken care of." And took her across the street to the medical emergency room part of it. And they took care of her, and she came back, and we talked about why she'd cut herself. And her therapist was away, and she was hurt that the therapist was away. And oh yeah, maybe there was some anger, but no, she loved her therapist. I said, well, it's very strange that you would do that. Number 1, that you would cut when you're missing your therapist. Maybe you hurt on the outside to deal with the fact that you don't know how to talk about hurting on the inside. And what about 4 cuts? Why not 3? Why not 17? What does 4 mean to you? Well, anyway, she went home, and I figured that was the end of it. About 6 months later, she called me, and she and her family came in. They'd been talking to her own psychiatrist for the last 6 months about transferring over to me. And I called the psychiatrist. The psychiatrist said, yeah, I'd appreciate it if you'd take her off my hands. I've not been having much luck with her. And I said, well, tell me the history. He said, oh, she's a schizophrenic girl, and she's been on, 80 of stelazine and 900 of thorazine, those kinds of medicines, giant doses, 3 different hospitalizations, 2 different psychological testings saying schizophrenic, history of hallucinating, ECT during 1 hospitalization. She's about 22, 23 years old. I said, all right. And by the way, I've been seeing her 5 times a week in supportive psychotherapy, and she goes to groups and daycare as well, group a number of times in daycare, and she lives on her own with another patient. So, and she's lived in a halfway house for a year before. So she'd been in daycare for a year and a half, and da-da-da-da. So she'd been, again, through every evidence-based practice that was possible at the time. And we talk and try to make sense of what's going on, and she tells me a little bit about herself. And gradually she tells me that after maybe 2 or 3 months that she has a good angel. And the good angel is on her right shoulder, a white-robed figure. I inquire into the good angel. What's the good angel about? I always try to take a history of figments or fantasies or delusions, how it developed. I don't know, it's been there for maybe 10, 12 years. It's just there, and da-da-da-da. What does the good angel say? Oh, the good angel tells me to cut myself. Like that day in the emergency room when I met you, it was a good angel telling me to cut myself. I say, good angel, right shoulder, huh? Well, I don't quite see it that way, but maybe this good angel is telling you to do bad things for you. So no, this is a good angel. It's been with me since maybe grammar school, sometime in grammar school. I don't know why, it just came up one day. And it says that I'm such a terrible person, too. I say, it says you're such a terrible person. What's so terrible about you? I don't know. So I'm gradually lowering medicines on her. She's down to maybe 1/3 of what she was taking. And after a couple more months, she says, there's a bad devil here too. I say, a bad devil? Well, tell me about the bad devil. I don't know, he just came up recently. He's telling me to do things like enjoy myself, try to live my life and do good things, and he's on my left shoulder. So we talked about it, and she realized that it was a projected introject of me. And there became a little war between the good angel and the bad devil over her shoulders and stuff like that. And I didn't say they're not there. I said, well, that's what you experienced. Let's just try to understand the symbology and make sense of it. And after about 1.5 years of therapy, good angel, bad devil, she's able to leave and go home. She's taking 1/5 of the antipsychotic she was taking when she first came in. She's no longer going to daycare, no longer going to group. She's just seeing me. And from her home, some distance away, she gets a job. She comes in every week or 2. And this continues for about 2 years. So I thought that was pretty good. And I thought there was more to the story than good angel, bad devil, and they'd kind of quieted down as she understood that they probably were coming from her. We didn't understand the reasons for them, but she was feeling well enough to work and live it back at home with her family. So, as I said, 2 years later she comes back and says, okay, I'm here in therapy, and I really don't want to take any medicines. We had something yesterday about the uncanny. Remember in that first presentation that Jeff was doing, the patient said something about speaking. When Jeff was speaking, somehow he had intuited it, and she had clearly intuited that I love the idea of a person going off antipsychotics. As far as I know, I never said it to her, but she got the drift of my decreasing the medication. So I covered myself and said, well, it's against my medical advice, but of course, if that's what you insist on, I'll go along with it, and if you need to go in the hospital, need to be back on medicine, then you'll take it. You agree? She said, sure. I said, okay. She comes in the next day, and she looks kind of different, and she says in a very bombastic tone, 9 months from now is my birthday. I will decide in these 9 months if I will live or die. I look at her. It doesn't sound like this nice, meek girl I've been talking with. And then she lies down on the floor and starts to writhe around. After about 5 or 10 minutes of writhing, I say, what's happening? She said, she doesn't say anything. And then she writhes a little more, and I say, come on, tell me, what just happened here after she stopped writhing? She says, again in a pretty bombastic tone, I'm now born in a new way. I say, you're born in a new way, huh? What do you mean? She said, I just gave birth to myself. I said, oh, that's interesting. Who'd you give birth to? And she says, I gave birth to a 4.5-year-old girl in a pink and white checked dress. She's right here. I say, no kidding. That's interesting. I mean, I see you as this 20-something girl, and you see her as a woman, and you see yourself as this 4.5-year-old girl. She said, yeah. I said, well, has this 4.5-year-old girl been with you before? I said, oh yeah, she's been with me a lot. When I look in the mirror, I see her. I say, oh, well, how did she get here? I said, I don't know, she's kind of always been with me. What's her name? Judy. Oh, Judy. Well, can Judy tell me something about what's going on? She said, well, Judy's been there since I was 4.5, and I don't know, she's just always been there. I said, is anybody else there? She said, oh, Mother God. I said, Mother God? Well, now who's Mother God? So whereas before we had this good angel, well, now we have the real deal, the Mother God, the underlying white-robed figure who has been with her since she was 4.5. And what does Mother God have to say? Oh, she says, you're such a terrible person. Such a terrible person. I say, who's such a terrible person? You? She said, oh no, not me. I say, well, let me get this straight. So there's Mother God, and this little girl is Judy, so who's the terrible person? The monster. I say, a monster? What's she look like? Well, she's short and fat, and she's very bad. And we don't like her. So suddenly there are these 3 beings, and I try to understand what the 3 beings are all about. As I always do, I try to take a history. So the history that came up from all 3 of them was that this little girl, Judith we'll call her, was a very smart, creative little girl, lots of mischief. But the mother didn't really want to be bothered too much. The mother was often preoccupied with this or that. So the mother reamed out a baby bottle nipple and would put her to bed very early with milk or juice and try to get her to go to sleep right away. But often she would just lie there and fantasize. And what would she fantasize about? Well, she fantasized about how she didn't like her brother. She remembers her brother being born when she was 3 1/4, 3 1/2. And he had that little thing on him, so she'd think about snipping off that little thing with scissors, or maybe she'd think about her mother cutting carrots with a knife, and she'd fantasize about doing that. She didn't like her little brother because he got all this attention, and she didn't get much attention at all. You know, she was a good pianist and stuff, but once this little boy came along, in the particular kind of family structure that they had, he got all the attention. So she was angry that the mother nursed him, angry that the mother seemed to dote on him, that the father, who had seemed so indifferent to her, busy, preoccupied businessman that he was, suddenly had time and attention for the little boy. But she knew it was a fantasy, and she was okay. And Judy and Mother God and the monster weren't there. Suddenly, and she hated the little boy, suddenly the mother trips and falls, breaking the little boy's leg. And the mother, as maybe many mothers would, said, "I don't know how it happened, I tripped and fell." And the little girl thinks, "I did it. My thoughts caused it. Somehow my angry thoughts caused my mother to trip and fall." Well, so we talked about that for quite a bit. And by this time it was 7 months from the time that she was reborn in my office. And I say, "Hey, you know, this is fascinating. I'd love to continue talking about it, but we got a really big issue we got to talk about." She said, "Oh, what's that?" I said, "Well, you said that 9 months from now, 7 months ago, you said 9 months from now, I'll decide if I'll live or die. We got 2 months to go. We should talk about that." And she starts raging at me, screaming at me, because she, of course, was going to kill herself. And in her mind, she was convinced, she as Mother God and as Judy were convinced that they could kill the monster who had wished that her little brother would die. The monster who she was convinced had caused the fall of the mother and the breaking of the brother's leg. So then, of course, we have to deal with this. But luckily, the creativity of these people is manifold, and she suddenly started to come up with another presence, the smiling man's voice. Remember the bad devil from before? Now there was another internal interject, the smiling man's voice. I'm sure it was me, she's sure it was me. And he was saying the very same things on the inside that I was saying on the outside. Things like, "Well, you know, if you think you can kill yourself and still live, if you think that Judy and Mother God can kill that believed in monster, I got news for you, you're going to kill everything." So there were some serious times. I probably hospitalized her once or twice during this time. For very short periods. She once, I came to the waiting room, there was blood all over the place. She had cut herself. I dragged her over to the emergency room and probably swore at her a little bit about the whole thing. And then she was so happy that I'd shown so much interest, and she told my friends over at the medical emergency room what a terrible guy I was. And she loved that part of it. And to make a long story short, by the time of her birthday, about 9 months after her being reborn, she seemed pretty fine. And there was no suicide attempt. Shortly afterwards, medications were stopped entirely. So was that the whole story? I wasn't sure. Soon there were intense fantasies of nursing, of enemas, of whitish fluid, of every orifice having something going into it. This was followed by the attack of the penises, the attack of the snakes. She gave me a plant, a mimosa plant, a sensitive plant, she called it. She even named it cicatrix for scarred. And soon snakes were jumping out of the plants in my office, out of the chair, and they were all headed for her mouth, and soon there were penises heading towards her. she began to call me no longer a therapist, but the rapist. She broke it down. What's this about? I asked. She doesn't know. She has no idea. Did you ever see a penis? Well, she saw her little brother's penis, but she never saw male penis. Oh, I keep inquiring and asking. I'm seeing her 4 times a week, 5 times a week when it seemed critical. And gradually material began to emerge about her grandfather. We know that her mother had kept her home from school and kindergarten when she began vomiting. But from the age of 4.5 to nearly 6, material emerged about her grandfather and his molesting her, making her special, using a gun at times to molest her, telling her that she was not only special but that he'd kill himself if she ever told anybody. Everything fell into place in a psychotic way when, shortly before she was 6, her grandfather did kill himself with a gun. She became certain that unwittingly she had thought angry thoughts at him, and here too the angry thoughts had caused something terrible to happen in reality. There were other aspects of her being which we gradually understood, but little by little she came to the realization that in fact her grandfather had done this terrible thing to her for this period of time. She found another relative who'd been molested by him, and she reintegrated. And so this whole piece of work off antipsychotics for the last couple of years of what I'm telling you about took maybe 3.5, 4 years. And for the last 35 years, this person has worked and functioned and had relationships with people and been an active member of society. So here too, is it better to have someone loaded up on antipsychotics, believing that they are a chronic paranoid schizophrenic as she was diagnosed? Or is it better to have a life of relationship and function, having understood the full panoply of her believed in presences and entities? To my mind, this is a cure. Definitely a transformation. I go for cure. Any questions? Well, I think time is running short, so I thank you all.